Happy Mother's Day. We are so thankful you decided to come and spend this Mother's Day with us, and we really do highly honor you. Um, about a dozen years or so ago, I read a book that as a parenting was both exceptionally profound for me and really troubling. It's written by a guy named Nicholas Walterstorff. He's a professor at Yale University, and the name of the book is Lament for a Son. And in it, he describes the death of his son Eric, who at 25 died in a mountain climbing accident. He writes about how painful it was for him to lose his child. And one of the parts of the book that I remember most was when he's talking about that he couldn't even look at pictures of his son because it hurt him so much because he realized there would never be any more pictures of his son, that he was sort of just frozen at 25 and he'd never see any more. He tells about when he was clearing away some of Eric's things, and he sort of imagined that he heard his son come in and say, "Hey, Dad, I'm back." And then he realized he'd never hear those words, that he'd never be back. Today we're continuing this series we've been in called God for the Rest of Us, and I want to talk to you about the God who is for the hurting. You talk about hurting. As the father of three sons, I cannot imagine the immensity of that pain. It's so profound to me to think about the depths of that kind of hurt. But for some of you, you don't have to imagine that hurt. You've had that hurt. That's where you live. For others of you, you haven't had that exact kind of hurt, but you've had other kinds of hurt. You've experienced the death of someone close to you that you have trouble getting over, or maybe it wasn't that, maybe it was some kind of abuse, maybe you were exposed to sexuality when you were way too young by an inappropriate person, in the wrong kind of way, and you still suffer with that. Or maybe you've been physically abused or emotionally abused, or maybe it's the fact that your body just doesn't work the way it's some kind of something broken in your body and you hurt because of it, because of what you don't have or because of what you can't do, because of the hurt you feel in your body. And for you, hurting and pain is an everyday kind of thing. There are all kinds of ways that we wind up going through our life with deep hurt. But you know, in the midst of the hurt, the questions that really trouble us is, can God do anything about the hurt? And if he can do anything about it, why doesn't God do something about it? See, in the midst of my hurt, it may be that I think that God can do it, but the real question is, why doesn't God do something for me? I mean, why doesn't he change the hurt that I feel? If God is for the hurting, can he do anything about my pain? And if he can, why doesn't he do something for me at the time? I mean, some of you may be hurting right now and you're wondering, my hurt, my pain, my problem is so deep, can God ever fix me? Well, today, I want to take us to a story out of the account of the life of Jesus that's written by a guy named Luke, and it's an account that's very much like the story of Nicholas Walterstorff tells in his book. You know, Christians, we believe, and I'm not saying you have to believe this, but Christians believe that Jesus is the exact representation of God. And what that means is that Jesus wasn't the Son of God. He wasn't just close to God than anybody else. What you see in Jesus is exactly what you can know about God. So it's important for us in this particular account to see how God deals with, how Jesus deals with, how God feels about hurting people. Again, this is written by a guy writing about the life of Jesus. His name is Luke. Here's what he says. Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd were with him. As they approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. Now, All of us, we've witnessed something like that. By that I mean we've been somewhere and in the middle of what we were on our way to do, like Jesus was on his way to do something, we've seen a funeral procession coming by. Years ago, and I've told some of you this story before, but it's what I think about every time I think about a funeral procession. I was personally involved in a funeral as the minister doing the funeral. I was very young. And, again, I know that in telling this story, it's going to cause some of you to think less of me, but it's true, and it is what I think about every time that every time I think about a funeral procession. Well, anyway, I was involved in this funeral, and I had spoken at the funeral, and we were leaving the funeral home to go to the cemetery to bury the body, and I was in the procession in my car, driving behind the hearse and the family, and we were on our way to the cemetery. Well, in the midst of it, it was a long drive, and I sort of forgot, I just was daydreaming about what I had to do later and what I was thinking about, what I was going to say at the procession, but then it quickly morphed into I have so much to do, and at some moment in the midst of just driving, daydreaming while I was driving, I sort of snapped out of it, and I realized we were driving really slow, and I was in this line of cars, and I wondered why everybody was driving so slow, and it made me mad, and I was getting angry about the people in front of me who were driving so slow, and so I whipped out and began to pass the people, and it wasn't until I got up and I saw the hearse that I realized, oh my gosh, I'm in a funeral procession, and I got to get back in line. Well, Jesus is going somewhere, and he doesn't just daydream through the funeral procession. He sees this funeral procession, and he doesn't know the people. And there's a lot about this that we don't know. We know that this woman has lost her son, and that it's her only son, and that she also has lost her husband. But we don't know, is her husband just recently died? Is this a compound kind of death? Has it happened all of a sudden? We also don't know, is he her only child? Does she have daughters? Is there any other family with her at the time? What we probably can surmise, because of the time period and the climate where they are, that she's probably right in the midst of the grieving process. It's just started. It's just all hit her, because they buried bodies almost immediately in that day. Because it was a hot desert climate, and because there wasn't a great embalming process, they buried people right away. So this woman, it's raw, it's on her, it's fresh, and Jesus comes walking by. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this account, we can see some things about Jesus that we don't normally get to know. For instance, this account, Luke tells us how Jesus felt. I mean, did you notice that? It says, his heart went out to her. Now, in this book in the Bible was originally written in the Greek language, and the word used for heart there in the original Greek language is the word splachna, and it literally means intestines. It means your gut, and it means a twisting of the gut. It's that feeling you have when you're watching TV and all of a sudden you see a starving child in Africa, or it's when you have a friend that their house burns down and your heart goes out to them, but it's not where you feel it in your heart. You feel it in the pit of your stomach. That's what it says about Jesus in this verse, that he comes on this funeral procession and splachna. He feels it in his gut. His heart goes out to her. Now, what's really interesting to me is that unlike us, who we do see funeral processions, but it's not an everyday occurrence to us. It's sort of unusual now when we see it and we stop and we pull off. But in their day, funeral processions had to be an everyday occurrence because, mortality rate was high. People didn't live very long. And infant mortality, the death of children, was normal. It's sort of like when we go to Haiti and we're visiting in people's homes, and if you ask a couple how many children they have, they'll say they have 9, but what you find out is they only have 3 that are living, because infant mortality is still high in the developing world. Well, in their world, in this day, that's the way it was. And funeral processions, they were a regular occurrence. So people would often, they just wouldn't notice. When you see something so regularly, you just breeze by, but not Jesus. He doesn't know these people. He's just walking by, but he notices what's happening, and his heart goes out to this mother. This scene that was normal for everybody else, his heart is moved by her. But it's not just that. He tells her not to cry, but then he does something else as well. He did something. Sometimes you can feel that emotional pain, and you're moved, and you feel it in the pit of your stomach, but either you don't know what to do, or you're such in deep pain you don't know if you could do it, or maybe, honestly, You feel it, but you don't even care enough to do something. But not Jesus. Jesus is moved to do something. He not only felt something, but he's moved to do something. He cares and he's able. And did you notice what he did? The verse says, he walked up and he touches the coffin. Now, some of you may, if you're looking on your phone, or you may notice that some translations say he touched a different word. It's like a bier. It literally was just a piece of wood, like a backboard that they're carrying the boy on. That's what the coffin was in their day. And I don't think we're supposed to get the idea that Jesus walks over to the boy and he touches the piece of wood underneath the boy. I think the idea we're supposed to get is that Jesus walks over and he touches the boy. Now, that in of itself is odd. He's moved and he does something that literally in the moment, it wasn't done in their day to touch dead bodies, because in their world where everything's about, they believed they had to be ceremonially clean to have any right with God. There was an Old Testament law that said you can't touch a dead body, you become unclean, and the religious leaders had made all kinds of rules around that. So for Jesus to walk over and to touch a dead body, everybody would have just in that moment, they would have gasped. But what Jesus is saying to the leaders is, hey, compassion demands there's a higher value here. This woman is hurting, and I'm moved by it. And that boundary that we've put, the law wasn't meant to serve God that way. It was meant for people. People matter more. So your boundary has to go. I have to do something about this. And in the moment, I believe, when he touches the boy's body, the crowd probably they gasped. But I don't know if you noticed in the text, something else happened when he touched the boy. The boy gasped, and he came back to life. And Jesus told him to sit up, and he gave the boy back alive to his mother. Jesus feels something. He touches, and he does something. He heals the boy, and everything is changed for the mom. And when I say everything, I mean everything. One of the things I think that Luke is trying to tell us when he tells us that it was her only son, and that she's at a place where she's also a widow. In their day, women can't own property. Women can't own a business of their own, not in that culture. So when her only son, the only male in her family, the only one left, is gone, this woman's going to have to do something to produce income. And women were often driven, if another man wouldn't take her in, if she didn't have a male relative that would take care of her, she'd be driven to do unthinkable things to make money. If she had daughters to care for, her daughters would be as well. So in that moment, when the boy dies, her hope is gone. And Jesus is moved by her. He touches the boy. She gasped. The boy gasped. I think the woman gasped, because hope returned, and everybody is in awe, and they're praising God because Jesus had not only given her back her son, he'd given her back her hope. So again, what I want you to notice in this is, because what we see in Jesus, what Jesus felt and what he did, it's teaching us something about God, because Jesus is the exact representation of God. I want you to see what you can know about a God who sees you when you're hurting. You can know that God feels your pain, and God is willing to do something about your pain. So how does Jesus feel about your hurts? How does God feel about your hurts? Well, it's hard for us to believe we're in the middle of pain. When you're in pain, God feels splagna. He feels it in his gut. Now, I'll just tell you, when I've been in pain, deep pain, it's easy for me to assume that God doesn't see me. And my mind begins to work overtime. And I think in the midst of my pain that the reason I'm hurting the way I am is because God doesn't see and God doesn't care, or that maybe even if God does care, he doesn't even see me, because, there's 7 billion people on the planet, and God sees all of the hurting people, and maybe it's just an every moment occurrence to him, and that my pain in my moment, while it matters deeply to me, God can't care about all the hurting people at the same time. So God, it's just an everyday occurrence to him. He just breezes by it. But that's the cool thing about this story, is that we notice that even though it was every day for everybody else, Jesus sees, Jesus stops, Jesus notices, Jesus feels it. Jesus noticed, and he felt what she was feeling. He not only noticed he cared about what she's feeling. And Jesus being the exact representation of God, it tells us that's who our God is. But you may be thinking, what if he sees and he cares, what can he actually do about my hurt? Well, the truth is, he can do for us exactly what he did for this woman. He can bring healing. He can bring back hope. Because, see, the truth is, we don't just believe Jesus was a person who cared, was a person who lives. We believe he is a person who lives. He didn't just care for people. He does care for people. He didn't just at one time heal hurts. He still heals hurts. Because Jesus, we believe, was resurrected, and he is alive, and he is with us. That's who our God is. That's what we know about him. And whatever's happened, whatever you feel, wherever you are, however you're feeling, Jesus can bring healing and hope back into your life. And I'll just say to you, if that's hard for you to believe, I get it, but you're in the right place. And I'll tell you why. It's because if you struggle to believe those things, this is a place not just for people who believe all the right things. This is for people who don't yet believe. This is church for the rest of us. This is for people who do have doubts, who do have pain, who do have questions about God. This is the perfect place for that. And we are okay with you coming and asking your tough questions. As hard as it is for some of you to believe that Jesus is still alive, or that he still even cares, that if he is alive, that he still even sees, or that he still even heals, that's okay. We understand that. And if you'll look into this, what I have found is that human suffering isn't an argument against there being a God that cares, because when you read the Bible and the God that Jesus reveals, Jesus is very clear that suffering is a part of what's going to happen in this world. In fact, a lot of people seem to think that what Jesus teaches is, hey, follow me, put your trust in me, and all bad things, I'll take care of that. But that's not at all what he says. In fact, let me just show you one of the many times this picture is clear. Jesus looks at his disciples one time and he says to them, in this world, you will have trouble. Now, some of you don't believe anything in the Bible, but you believe that because that's been your life. You've had trouble. Jesus said that. In this world, you're going to have trouble. And he didn't say to his followers, hey, so you don't need to worry about tomorrow. You don't need to worry about the future because, hey, follow me. I've taken care of the future. There's no need for you to worry about it. I'll make sure there is no trouble. What Jesus says is, hey, you don't need to worry about tomorrow because today has enough trouble of its own. Jesus says the truth about this world is there's trouble today. You don't need to worry about tomorrow. There's trouble today. There'll be trouble tomorrow. He says God will take care of you. In spite of the trouble, he'll be with you in the trouble, not because there'll never be any trouble if you trust me. He said there will be trouble. See, the appearance of trouble and hurt and pain in the world is not an argument against the existence of God or the Bible being true. In fact, if there were no trouble in this world, if there were no pain, it would be an argument that the Bible isn't true, because Jesus repeatedly says there will be trouble. Jesus had trouble in his day. All of the people who followed him closely, they had trouble in their day. And so the truth is there's going to be suffering in this world, but Jesus notices, he sees, he cares. Jesus is involved in our hurt. And I get that maybe it's hard for you to believe that right now, but it's okay for you to be in this place and to have those doubts and ask those questions, because many of us have been in the exact same place. This world, not hurting, we're not hurting because that's the way God designed it. There isn't trouble, and Jesus says it because God made it that way, because when God made the world and created it, there was no trouble, there was no pain. The truth is our trouble is because humans have messed up the world, and we hurt each other so deeply, and the pain that comes into the world is because of us. And yet our God, he sees and he's with us. In fact, if you study this, what you'll come to realize is God hurts too. God hurts too over the trouble. I mean, we often question why God allows us to hurt. We need to understand that because we hurt, God hurts too. In fact, because he loves us, his guts are twisted like ours are. He feels it. That's the realization that Nicholas Walterstorff eventually comes to. He writes about it in the book, the pain over losing his son, he eventually comes to realize the pain he feels is like the pain that God felt because God sent his son. God's son died, and he felt that pain. In fact, at one point he writes, "It's been said that no one can behold God's face and live. I always thought that was because no one could see God's splendor and live." A friend said to me, "Maybe it's because nobody can see God's sorrow and live." And then he adds, "Or perhaps God's sorrow is his splendor." Maybe God's sorrow is God's splendor. Maybe the greatest thing about God is that God feels the pain of his people with his people, that he hurts with his people, even though he has the power not to. So if you have questions like, why does God allow this? Why does God not do something about this? This pain certainly proves that God does not love me. Or if you ever have doubts about why Jesus heals, but it doesn't seem to be happening to you, know that those questions are okay. God is not troubled by your questions, but at the same time, while it's okay to have those questions, understand we have been right there with you, but many of us who have been right where you are and have experienced those questions and those doubts, we've experienced something different as well. We've experienced that eventually. We've experienced the comfort and the healing of God. So even though we understand where you are with your doubts, at the same time, we've experienced this, that God can and does and still does heal people from their hurting. Today brings healing to people even in their hurting. Now I do need to add, it doesn't always happen instantly. It may happen that way, but it's not necessary that it happens that way. It may take some time. And maybe you see that and you wonder why. Why does it take some time? Well, maybe sometimes it's because maybe we're not ready really to be healed. There's an account in the Bible that I can remember one of the first times I read it. It tells how it bothered me. I didn't really understand it. There's this guy who's been at a place to get healing, and he's been there for more than 30 years. And Jesus comes up to him, walks over to him at one point, and says to him, "Do you want to be well?" Well, obviously, the answer to that question is he's been there 30-something years. He wants to be well. Of course he wants to be well. But maybe the answer isn't that obvious. Maybe that's why Jesus asked it. See, sometimes maybe we're not ready for all that it comes with healing. Maybe not all that God needs to change in us, that God needs to do in us. Maybe there are things that have to change about us, and maybe we aren't ready for all of that. Maybe that's why it doesn't happen automatically. Maybe that's why it takes some time. I'll say this. I don't know if you thought about this in the story. I wonder sometimes if it doesn't happen sometimes in the way it wanted to or the way we want it to be, because we literally aren't putting our lives in a path where Jesus is on the path. I mean, and what I mean by that is this woman and her son gets healed. This woman and her hurt, it gets removed primarily because she's where Jesus can touch her. I mean, there had to be lots of healings within just, of deaths, of funeral processions within just a few miles of where Jesus is at this moment. But they don't all get resurrected. Their boys aren't all brought back. Their hurt isn't all automatically removed. This one happens because this woman is on the path that Jesus is on so that he can touch her. He can touch her son. He can bring him back to life. And I wonder sometimes if the reason we don't get is because we haven't put ourselves on the path where God could do it. Maybe it means you haven't really been praying about it. Or maybe you have. Maybe you have been praying, but you haven't prayed openly with other people, and you haven't told them what the hurt really is. You haven't prayed with other people. Or maybe you've done that, but you haven't put yourself in a place where there's things that God needs to change to you. Maybe some of your hurt needs to be dealt with a good Christian counselor. Or maybe if it's physical, there's something that you need to talk about with a doctor that you're just uncomfortable dealing with, and you want God to do something that you're not on the path where he should be. I don't know. I'm just saying maybe that's the reason it hasn't happened as quickly as you want. It may not happen immediately. But as you put yourself on the path of where Jesus is, where he can reach out and he can touch you, Many of us experience that at some moment he will touch you, and something inside of you will like gasp. And it'll be like dead in you being brought back to life. But what if you're doing all of that stuff and you're on the path and you're still hurting? What next? What do I do if I continue to hurt? Well, I want to talk to you about that as some next steps that we can take today out of this. So if you would go ahead and take your connection card. It's probably on a chair nearby you there. We talked about it early in the service. And if you're with us for the first time, let me just also add how glad we are that you came, that you joined in. We don't think you came by accident today, and we'd love to know that you came to be a part of this. So if you just write your name and away and we can contact you on there, we won't do anything odd with it. Really, one of the main things we want to do is say thank you for coming and see if there's any way we can help you. And we pray for every one of these cards by name when they come in. We'd love to do that for you. But on the back of it, there are also some next steps we hope you'll think about taking between you and God. The first one, if you're in the middle of hurting and you want to do what might be the next step for you, is can I suggest that you give God the benefit of the doubt? See, what I mean by that is the time to figure out what you believe about God is not in the middle of your hurting, because sometimes in the middle of your hurting, you're hurting so bad that emotionally the pain is louder than the rational thought you have, and you begin to think things that aren't really true. The time to figure out what you believe about God is when you look at who Jesus is clearly, and you see a God who loves you, and a God who reaches out, and a God who touches, and a God who heals, and a God who changes things. I remember hearing my friend Jason Collins, who also is part of our teaching team, talk about on the death of his son, that he learned that you can't forget when you're in those dark moments the things that you knew to be true when you're in the light. See, when you're in the light. It's when you're in the moments where you can think clearly and you know that God loves you. Read about Jesus, the exact representation and how he touches hurting people and he heals hurting people. Is you get a clear picture of who God is. And then when you step into the dark that you didn't want to go into, you remember what you believed in the light, you hold on to it, and you give God the benefit of the doubt in the dark. I mean, that's the kind of relationship you want to have with people, the people that will give you the doubt, benefit of the doubt. I mean, if you were going out to eat with somebody and your friend, you told them you'd be somewhere at a certain time, and when they get to the restaurant, they're sitting there all along and you're late. I mean, they can begin to think, jerk, he didn't show up on time, he's always late, or maybe he's not even my friend, he doesn't care about him. What you're hoping will happen when you're late is that your friend will say, I wonder what happens. They're so reliable. I know they're my friend. I know they care about me. I wonder if something has happened to them. They don't immediately think bad about you. They give you the benefit of the doubt. See, the time to figure out what you believe about God is in a moment where where you ask your questions openly and you listen to people who aren't in the midst of hurting tell you about the God that is represented by Jesus, who shows up in the pages of the Bible, who heals and helps hurting people. And then in the dark, you give God the benefit of the doubt until you can see it clearly again in the light. Second, when you're hurting, in the midst of your hurting, will you remember that you're just in the middle of the story? Near the very end of the book, Nicholas Waltersdorf comes to this realization about God's promises of resurrecting all the dead one day, that it won't just be Jesus that was resurrected, but that all the dead, including his son Eric, and that he'll hear his son Eric say to him again at the resurrection, hey, Dad, I'm back. He's reading some words from Scripture that are in the Bible near the end, and he hears them as almost God saying them in the end. It's in Revelation that says, look, God's dwelling place is now among people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be there and be their God. And he will wipe away from their every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or mourning or crying of pain, for the old order of things has passed away. I am making everything new. And then he writes, so goodbye, Eric. Goodbye. Until we see. Earlier, I read you the words of Jesus from John where he says, in this world, you'll have trouble. What I didn't tell you is that's only the middle of the story. Jesus ends that by saying, in this world, you will have trouble. But be aware But no, take heart, I have overcome the world. See, we're just in the middle of the story. The end of your story has not yet been written. There's suffering in our story. There's trouble in our story. There's hurt in our story. But we have a God who is for the hurting, who is with the hurting, who cares about the hurting, who touches the hurting, and who brings healing. And for now, there's hurting. For now, there's pain. For now, there's question. Now, there's doubt. But God will wipe away every tear and will be with us and will touch us and will heal us and make everything new. So, until we see, let me pray. Father, until we see, help us hold on to what we know to be true. Until we see what we hold by faith, help us to stand with each other and help each other to remember that you are a God who's for the hurting. God, I pray for people right now that have joined in, that they would give you the benefit of the doubt and that they would remember they're just in the middle of this thing. For people that have questions and doubts, help them to understand that it's okay for them in that moment to have that and to ask their questions and try to come to answers to their questions, to know that you are still for them, that you still love them. Thank you for Jesus, who shows us exactly who you are. In his name I pray. Amen.